Getting to yes in a negotiation. It's the goal, right? Well, what if I told you the very thing that gets you a yes in one country could absolutely sink your deal in another? Today, we are diving deep into the super tricky, high-stakes world of global negotiation and how to navigate those cultural waters without capsizing your whole deal. Okay, picture this. You're on a call, you think you've just closed a massive deal. And then you hear this. Whoa. Your heart just plummets, right? Your mind is racing. What did I just say wrong? Yeah, that one question didn't just end a conversation. It killed the entire deal. Weeks, maybe months of work just gone. Poof. And this isn't some made-up example. It's a true story. And it just goes to show how incredibly critical cultural understanding is, especially when there are millions of dollars on the line. All right, let's get into it. Let's break down this deal gone wrong. Our main character is an experienced American negotiator, a guy who really thought he had all his bases covered. But, spoiler alert, he was about to learn a very, very expensive lesson about making assumptions across cultures. So here's the play-by-play. You've got Tim Carr, our American negotiator, on the phone with a super important Saudi client. They're trying to close this sensitive defense contract. To seal the deal, Tim does what any good American negotiator would do, right? He carefully recaps every single point of their verbal agreement. For him, that's just being thorough. It's dotting the I's. But for his Saudi counterpart, it was a massive insult to his honor. And boom, there it is. The key takeaway. The very thing he did to confirm a yes actually got him a hard no. It just proves that the tools in your negotiation toolkit that work wonders at home can be an absolute disaster when you're playing on the global stage. So the big question is, how do we avoid falling into these traps? Well, what we need is a kind of framework, right? A culture map, if you will, to help us see and navigate these invisible boundaries. So let's start decoding some of these unspoken signals. Okay, now this is fascinating. This culture map shows us something that's not at all intuitive. It separates how emotionally expressive a culture is from how confrontational it is. You'd think those two things would go hand in hand, right? But look, up at the top left, you've got Germany, the Netherlands. They're not very emotionally expressive, but they're totally okay with confrontation. Then you look down at the bottom right, Saudi Arabia, Mexico. They're very emotionally expressive, yet they really try to avoid confrontation. Getting your head around this is absolutely critical. All right, let's dive into our first rule, disagreeing productively. This is all about the language of conflict. And you've got to understand, disagreement sounds totally different depending on where you are in the world. What you might hear as a personal attack could actually just be an invitation for a really good, healthy debate. So the key here is to listen for what are called upgraders and downgraders. Upgraders are words that make a disagreement stronger, like totally, completely, absolutely. Downgraders, on the other hand, soften it. Words like partially, maybe, a little bit. So if your German counterpart says they completely disagree, don't panic. It probably just means they're ready to have a good debate. But if your colleague from Mexico says they disagree a little bit, you might have a much bigger problem on your hands. And this quote from a Russian student, it just hits the nail on the head. In Russia, you go into a negotiation expecting a big, passionate debate. A fiery, I totally disagree isn't a red flag at all. In fact, it's a green light. It means they're engaged and ready to dig in and solve this thing together. Okay, moving on to rules 2 and 3, which are totally interconnected, emotion and trust. Now we're going a little deeper, moving beyond just the words to really understand the heart and the head of the person sitting across from you. So rule 2 is all about knowing when to bottle it up or when to let it all pour out. You know, in some places, like Denmark or Germany, being calm and factual is the ultimate sign of professionalism. But take that same calm demeanor to France or Mexico, and they might think you're just not interested or passionate about the deal. You've got to know the local code. This story about a German negotiator is a perfect example. He's in a meeting with his French counterparts, and they start debating passionately. Voices are raised, hands are waving. He's sitting there thinking, oh man, this deal is completely falling apart. But for the French team, that was a great meeting. Afterwards, they were all smiles and went out for a fantastic dinner to celebrate. Okay, now for rule 3, trust. And trust really comes in 2 main flavors. First up, you have what's called cognitive trust. This is trust from the head. It's totally task-based. You build it by being reliable, by showing you're competent, you hit your deadlines, you know your stuff. This is the bedrock of business trust in places like the US and Germany. And then there's the other flavor, effective trust. This is trust from the heart. It's all about relationships. It comes from sharing a meal, having a laugh, just getting to know each other on a personal level. And in many parts of the world, think China, Nigeria, Brazil, you really can't get to that cognitive, task-based trust until you've built this personal, effective trust first. You have to remember, in these cultures, the relationship comes first and the deal follows. All right, let's get to our final two rules, numbers 4 and 5. This is where the rubber meets the road. It's all about yes, no, and contracts. And you really want to pay attention here because this is where some of the most frustrating, deal-killing misunderstandings can happen. Okay, rule 4 is a big one. Yes does not always mean yes, and no does not always mean no. I'll say that again. Yes doesn't always mean yes. For example, in a culture like Indonesia's, saying no directly is considered pretty rude. So you might hear something like, "We will try our best," which is actually a very polite way of saying no. On the flip side, in a place like France, hearing no over and over again doesn't mean the deal is dead. It's often just their way of saying, "Okay, let's dig into this and discuss it further." Now for Rule 5, the contract. For some people, like in the United States, a signed contract is the finish line. It's the final word. The negotiation is officially over, the discussion is done, and now it's time to get to work. But for others, a signed contract is the starting gun. It's not the end of the negotiation, it's the beginning of the relationship. It's a written understanding, sure, but it's a flexible one. The assumption is that as the relationship and the market change, the contract can change with it. And check out this quote from a Nigerian manager. It's so powerful. He says, "If the moment we come to an agreement, you pull out the contract, I start to worry." Wow. Think about that. The very act of wanting a written contract right away can signal that you don't trust their word. And in their culture, their word is everything. Okay, so we've talked about all these potential landmines. Disagreements, emotion, trust, contracts. It's a lot, right? So what's the single best tool you can have for success? It's not a book, it's not a seminar, it's a person. You need to find your cultural bridge. So what does a cultural bridge do? Well, they're the person on your team who gets both cultures. They're your interpreter for all the unspoken stuff. They can tell you what that long silence really meant, or explain why your perfectly timed joke landed with a thud. They're the one who can pull you aside and say, "Hey, slow down. We need to build the relationship here before we even think about talking business." They are absolutely invaluable. But, and this is a huge but, be very careful here. Don't just assume that because someone speaks the language or has the right passport, they can be your cultural bridge. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a story about a British manager who was of Korean heritage. He spoke perfect Korean, and he actually made things worse when he went to negotiate. Why? Because the local team saw him, heard him speak, and expected him to act and think like a Korean. But he was culturally British. He had the language, but not the deep cultural fluency. That's a critical difference. And that really brings us to our final and maybe most important takeaway. The next time you're gearing up for a big global negotiation, of course, you're going to think about your strategy, your numbers, your bottom line, but you need to ask yourself one more question, a really critical one. Who is my cultural bridge? Who on my team can read what's happening between the lines?